We start with writer Jack Torrance having driven 3 friggin' hours into the mountains for a simple job interview. And before you can say, maybe he should have just checked if the local Mackies was hiring, his new boss says that the remote overlook hotel what he's going to be looking after over the winter is a bit dodgy, given the last caretaker called Grady totally went nuts and carved up his whole family like common hogs.
Oh shit, not good.
Whilst back at home, his wife Wendy tries to reassure their loner son Danny that he'll totally make new friends in the isolated empty hotel what they're going to be living in for the next 5 months. But turns out this kid is a right weirdo, what puts on a silly voice and talks through his index finger called Tony. Was Sam she? Anyway, after Jack reassures his new boss that he totally won't go mad like the other fella did, a nervous Danny talks to his finger in the mirror and has a bunch of ominous visions about this hotel place what he's never been to before but is about to move into for the winter season, including a flood of blood coming from a random elevator and stuff. Later, the family arrive at the resort and get settled in, whilst Danny spots a pair of silent twins just staring at him and what could be the new friends he's been looking to make. And before he can say, looks like it's going to be a good winter after all, boys, he meets a local cook called Halloran, who keeps calling the little lad Doc, and Wendy soon asks him how the frig he knows her child's nickname when no one mentioned it before, as giant alarm bells are starting to ring now strange black bloke seems to know all about their intimate family life. But he just says it was a lucky guess. Kinda like when you somehow complete the day's Wordle puzzle on your first attempt, or finally managing to remember your wife's birthday for a change.
It's about damn time. It's about damn time.
And after Danny hears a strange ringing noise in his head when staring at the strange black bloke, said strange black bloke soon sits him down and takes 20 minutes to basically tell him he's psychic, and that they both share a telepathic connection, what he calls the Shining, where you can see glimpses of things that have already happened or maybe haven't even happened yet. And he soon tells Danny that the hotel also has a shine thing due to all the bad stuff that's happened here and printed into its walls and shit, and then warns him to avoid room 237, because it's totally haunted, bro, and not even Zach Bagans could last a night in that place.
Bruh.
Anyway, 1 month later, and Jack is laying in all day and struggling to find inspiration for his writing, whilst poor Wendy is stuck doing all the hotel maintenance like a right mug, and also trying to entertain a prepubescent child by going for a walk in a giant fuck-off maze.
Oh, good lord!
Also later, Danny thinks about entering room 237 despite that strange psychic bloke explicitly telling him to never go near that sodding room, whilst a frustrated Jack, who's suffering with writer's block, passively aggressively bites Wendy's head off for coming into his office and disturbing his flow, and presumably also for distracting him from creepily staring out of windows all day. Anyway, that weekend, a super strong snowstorm descends on the hotel, and Wendy radios the local police station given the phone lines are all down in this very remote and isolated area, but they just say, well, that sounds like a you problem, son, because that's just what happens around these parts and could last the entire season, so you best get used to it already. Meanwhile, little Danny is off minding his own business on a mostly peaceful bike ride before he runs into them random widow twins again. And although they invite him into their room to, quote, come and play with them, I guess he's too much of an incel virgin type to nut up and romance a few birds already, and seems like he'd rather sit and talk to his finger than spend time with a pair of eager lady friends, especially after he keeps experiencing disturbing visions of their bloody dead bodies and shit. Because I guess that's a real mood killer, son. A few days later, and a tired spaced-out Jack tells his boy that he loves him, and that he'd never ever harm one hair on his precious noggin, whilst Danny later finds the door to room 237 wide open and immediately heads in. And before you can say, this'll end well, Jack has some terrifying nightmares about carving up his family like common hogs, and instead of his wife simply backing away and saying you need to see a fucking shrink, mate, Danny walks in a strange traumatised trance and with bruises all over his neck. And bizarrely, Wendy totally blames Jack for potentially doing a Homer Simpson just because he has a short temper and recently started dreaming about killing all his family and shit. But he's just like, I didn't do nothing or nothing, bro. So naturally, he heads down to the empty bar to clear his head. But shockingly, he starts chatting to an imaginary barman who plies him with free alcohol, which then makes him admit to indeed smacking up his little boy 3 years ago when he lost his temper one day, and his dickhead wife has never let him forget it. But suddenly, Said dickhead wife bursts in and wailing about some naughty ghost was in one of the rooms upstairs and going around strangling their son and trying to drown him in the bathtub and stuff. And he just says, what on earth are you banging on about, woman? Because you're making less sense than Nancy Pelosi after a morning vodka binge, or even John Fetterman on a good day. But she says it's cool, bro, because I now don't believe it was you who strangled our boy despite you doing it once before and also being a Simpsons superfan. Because he told me a ghosty ghoulie spook was the one what did he. And we can totally trust the word of an 8-year-old boy what talks to his finger in silly voices. Whilst elsewhere, Halloran is hearing ear-piercing screeching and totally having an intense fit whilst watching the news in his hotel room over in Florida. And I can totally relate. For I also lose my shit when I see how much gas prices have gone up and how much of my taxes my government are sending off to Ukraine this week whilst I can't afford to heat a can of beans. Liberties! But anyway, Jack soon heads up to room 237 to tell the naughty spooks that going around and trying to drown young boys in small bathtubs just ain't fucking on, son. But shockingly, he just finds a gorgeous woman hanging around in his bathroom totally starkers. Naturally, and because it's the early 80s, he proceeds to snog her face off without even asking for her consent. But in a shocking twist, what no one could ever see coming. Turns out the sexy naked lady what's totally too good to be true is totally too good to be true. And she soon becomes an old withered hag who's trying to score herself a new toy boy. And no, not current day Madonna. Anyway, after Halloran fails to get through on the phones, given there's a major snowstorm going on, he decides to go over there himself after physically sensing that something's not quite right, whilst Jack tries to reassure his hysterical wife that everything's a-okay, bro, and says he didn't see a damn thing up there, and certainly not a smoking hot nudie naked woman what soon became a rotten decayed mess when he rudely forced some smoochies on her, so shut up about it already. And after he gaslights her about there being a perfectly rational explanation for their son almost being murdered that night, she says she wants to pack up their shit this instant and get the heck out of Dodge. Because she's sick of having to do all the manual work around here and also now worrying about ghosts drowning her only child in a small bathtub all night. But he just snaps again and says you must be a member of the British Parliament because all you do is fuck things up, bitch. So he then storms off in a rights drop and soon enters the dining hall where there seems to be a super swanky party going on. And after the ghostly barman gets him drunk on free booze again, a dopey butler bloke bumps into him and promptly releases warm liquid all over his body. It's steady. And after dragging him off to the box to give him a quick wipe down and not in the good way, the tipsy baffled American seems to recognise this posh British fella because he says his name's Grady, and Jack just can't believe he's being molested by the ex-caretaker what once went nuts and sliced up his family into little itty bits. And said Grady fella then snitches on his son Danny and tells his gormless father all about how he's been trying to telepathically reach out to that psychic chef bloke and get him to come down and help him out, before the base butler casually just drops his favourite N-word. And no, I don't mean nincompoop, but instead one that rhymes with trigger, which is what this scene will be for all the Gen Z snowflakes if they watch this flick unedited for modern audiences. And he just says that Jack needs to, quote, correct his naughty son, and also that interfering bug-eyed wife bird. So the next day, Jack disables the two-way radio as Halloran catches a flight back to Colorado, whilst a paranoid Wendy shuffles around the place with a giant baseball bat, and soon finds that her amateur writer husband is a right proper amateur, given he doesn't seem to understand the core basics of story structure. Cause even a 5-year-old knows you tend to need more than one sentence to tell a coherent story. And just repeating the phrase all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy ain't really going to win you any literary prizes or get you signed up to any credible publishing houses. Well, unless your name is E.L. James or Ibram X. Kendi, and in that case you can get away with writing any old shit, I guess. But suddenly, Jack totally confronts said bug-eyed wife, and he just can't believe she's reading his upcoming masterpiece before it's even finished. So he goes on an unhinged rant and threatens to bash the brains in of this paranoid woman who's armed with a baseball bat. So naturally, she smashes his brains in and then knocks her schizo-abusive spouse down the stairs.
Nice.
She then drags him down to the kitchen and dumps him in the back freezer like yesterday's turd, before he tries to convince her to let him out, by giving the least convincing performance since literally any cast member in that god-awful Lord of the Rings show last year. But she just says no chance, son, because you've lost your marbles, mate. And I'm taking our psychic kid with clear PTSD, what's going to need a lifetime of freaking therapy, out of here right fucking now. Later, the ghostly voice of the phony fakey butler bloke tells him he totally failed at doing his one job and murdering his whole family. And if they now let him out, then he better nut up and get on with a killing already. Whilst upstairs, Wendy's in bed given she thought she was totally safe now her homicidal hubby's locked downstairs in a freezer and despite the hotel being chock full of vengeful ghosts. And turns out this poor bird still can't catch a frigging break, because she wakes up to her messed up son skulking about in her room holding a carving knife and mumbling about alcoholic beverages.
Red rum.
Whilst then dyslexically writing about murder all over the walls. When suddenly, Jackie Boy's back and soon trying to cut down the door with a giant fuck-off axe. So she chucks the poor lad out a friggin' window before getting stuck in the tiny gap like a right mug. So she tells Danny to get the heck out of Dodge already, whilst Jack randomly thrusts his head through the door and now thinks his name's Johnny. Was some shit. And after giving him a little nick on the hand, it still can't stop him. And it looks like it's curtains for the laughably over-the-top bug-eyed wife. But luckily, they hear someone pulling up outside the hotel. So Jack dashes off downstairs to totally greet their new uninvited house guest. And the poor psychic chef who just cut short his holiday and took an expensive hours-long plane ride to get here out of the goodness of his heart don't last 5 minutes before he's sliced in the chest by a failed author, and the goodness of his heart just seeps out all over the floor of his workplace.
Damn!
Meanwhile, Wendy soon starts to see and hear the creepy ghosts of the hotel, including disembodied voices and some sort of kinky demonic furry, whilst a manic Jack soon chases a traumatised 8-year-old through the frozen maze, until Danny cunningly retraces the last few steps inside his own footprints to hide away like a right cuck. Before the boy's psychic visions from earlier soon comes true and poor Wendy almost gets drowned by a tsunami of blood. Lol, as you do. And once Jack follows a false trail, Danny retraces his steps and meets up with his knife-wielding paranoid bummy at the garden entrance. And before you can say, how has this kid not died of hypothermia already, given he's not wearing winter gear or even a small pack of Mac? They drive off in Halloran's motor, whilst local nutter Jack Torrance just decides to have a sit down and totally dies in the eyes.
Okay.
And we end with an old-timey picture from 1921, featuring that Jack fella partying in a room full of honkies, and with enough middle-class Caucasians in one room to give a corporate diversity officer a friggin' heart attack, son. And that's it. That's the movie. Though my favourite part was seeing just how much this loving mother cared about the well-being of her only son, when she's out here defenestrating him into ice-cold Arctic conditions without even a basic hat or coat, and also casually keeping lit cancer sticks in front of the kid's face when he's trying to eat his breakfast.
God damn!
But anyway, that's the plot and that's your lot. Considering in that mail thing so you don't miss any future recaps. Tell me if you like this flick in the comments if you have time. And I'll see you in the next one.